Where's my phone? Oh.
Can you view the attendees, sir? Izaha?
I can.
Can.
Yeah.
Can.
Yes, I can. Yeah, I can. Tapi no.
2 more minutes to go. So I think it's already 3 o'clock. Shall we start the session? All right.
Yep, let's do
So
it.
very good. Okay, a very good afternoon and salam sejahtera to everyone. I'm Vimala from MPC, will be the moderator for the session today. Welcome back to the webinar, GRP Webinar Series on the topic of Understanding Public Consultation in Malaysia Part 2, hosted by MPC. So currently we have about 32 attendees. It's already online. So there are more participants are coming in to join the session today. I would like to recap about our last week's session on the topic Understanding Public Consultation in Malaysia Part 1. So last week's session, we have discussed on the 5W1H on public consultation, importance of public consultation, and a bit on the stakeholder analysis, stakeholder mapping, principles for public consultation, and also we have touched on the consultation process. Yeah. So in the last week's session as well, we have asked the audience to vote for their favorite topic. Yeah. So as a result, the highest vote received for the topic of how to prepare a public consultation session. So with that, today's GRP webinar series, we're going to cover on pre, during and post consultation process. And also we will discuss on the relevant document, the important document for the public consultation, such as the consultation documents, consultation plan, and also one of the important document I personally feel, closure report. When we do the consultation, we must have a closure report in order to notify the stakeholder who are put trust and oath, who are giving comment for certain consultation. So moving forward, I would like to share a little background about our speaker for today, Mr. Muhammad Izham. He's a partner in the corporate and government advisory practice group at Zahid Ibrahim & Co., a member of Zico Law. His practice focuses in the area of law reform. This includes advising federal and state government, including ministries, regulators, statutory body on the end-to-end law reform. At the same time, his practice includes providing strategic and legal support to private sector clients interested in engaging the government in policy development and reform. Mr. Izaha also co-lead of the Zico Labs, Zico Law's Regional Corporate Social Responsibility CSR initiative to assist the startup and scale-up ecosystem. He worked with the local and international intermediaries in addition to the government agencies to support and provide legal assistance to emerging entities. Mr. Izaha also currently co-authoring a book on corporate governance and ethics in Malaysia. So, Mr. Izaha, when the publication going to publish? Anytime?
Supposed to be by the end of the year. Yeah, supposed
By
to be by
end
the
of
end of
the
the
year.
year.
All right, great to hear that. So before we start the session, ground rule to all the participants. First on the question. So during the webinar, participants are invited to send question either in Bahasa or English through the question box. So please, if you have any question and clarification, send it to the question box. At the end of the session, I will pass some of the question to the speaker. Yeah, but no worries, we will compile all the questions and we will send a written answer through email to all the participants after a few days after the session. So the slide presentation can be downloaded at the handout box, which you can see on your right side. So without further ado, I would like to invite our speaker for today, Mr. Izaha, to start the sharing session.
Okay, thank you so much, Vimala. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and good afternoon to everyone. As Vimala has introduced, my name is Izaha and I'm from Zico. I want to say thank you so much for taking your time this afternoon to join us for this session. And I hope that you are safe and healthy during this CMCO period. For those of you that tuned into part 1 last week, I want to say welcome back. And as you have voted, today's topic is how to prepare a public consultation session. Next slide, please. Okay. So in the spirit of public consultation, I've put up the results from the voting last week. You can see that on the far right. And you can see that the winning vote got about 64%, the others slightly less than 40%. I just want you to remember this information later on because we will use these results that we got from last week as a case study when we talk about the closure report. I'll show you this information again. Okay, on the left, that is the outline that we will talk about for today. So as promised, we have the topic of pre-public consultation, which is essentially the public consultation plan and the public consultation document. And then we have the public consultation session where we'll go into a public consultation case study. And then I'll highlight few 10 things that I think you should know. I don't think that list is exhaustive. Of course, there are more than that, but these are just things that you should think about. And then we'll talk about the post-public consultation session. So this will essentially be on the closure report, when and how to give feedback, and how do you measure success? I think that's a very good question someone asked last week, so I decided to put it in my slide. How do you measure success of your public consultation session? Next slide, please. Now, this is the slide that I showed last week in terms of the whole end-to-end consultation process that you can see in the guideline on public consultation procedures. If I can refresh your memory on this four-step process, you can see that there's a notification and preparation stage. That is the pre-consultation phase. Then you have the consultation stage, which is the consultation phase. And then you have the conclusion stage, which is a post-consultation stage. At the bottom, we have the timeline where the consultation pre-phase would take between 4 to 12 weeks. The consultation itself, the formal consultation, will take between 12 weeks, and the post-consultation will take up to 4 weeks, bringing it up to about 28 weeks in total. And then, as I mentioned last week, we have a lot of behind-the-scenes work. I think that's what we will get into today, which includes doing the stakeholder mapping, doing the identification of the engagement methods, determining the objectives for each consultation. So there's a lot of nitty-gritty behind the scenes. And then you also need to prepare the consultation document, which basically outlines the information on your consultation, which needs to be given to stakeholders within reasonable time. And then during the consultation, we'll go through that later. Those will be the 10 things that I want you to know about. I'll go through that later. And lastly, there'll also be the post-consultation phase, where we'll talk about the importance of the closure report, ending the consultation, and where you need to decide very quickly and early on in terms of how and if you want to communicate any feedback. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is planning the public consultation session. So what does it mean to actually plan the public consultation session? Let me just read the language that we have in the top box on the left. The act of gathering information on the needs and available resources and managing the information to agree on the purpose, scope, timeline, and actions to be taken in the public consultation process. Now, why do you think, based on that definition, it's important to plan the public consultation session? If you look at the bottom, I have a short list of things, and probably, as you would have guessed, why do you think it's important to plan the public consultation session? The answer would most probably be E, all of the above. First, let me say, because there are a lot of things to do. Yes, when you enter a public consultation, as I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of planning. If you just focus on conducting the consultation itself, you have to think about sending invites. You have to think about booking a venue. You have to think about arranging a speaker. You need to think about organizing food. You need to think about preparing material, and the list goes on. So there's a lot, even if you just hone into a particular aspect of the consultation session. Next is to involve as many stakeholders as possible, because the basic premise of consultation is to engage a range of stakeholders. If you don't identify the relevant stakeholders, you may realize that your consultation has been too narrow, and as a result, the feedback may not be accurate in terms of what you want to achieve. So, for example, if you want to know the impact of Makcik Kia's pisang goreng business in the kampung, it won't be sufficient if you speak to Pakcik Salim, who is a pisang goreng seller in the city. The considerations are totally different. Now, another point to consider is why, in terms of planning the public consultation session, is you may have public consultation requirements that you need to comply with. So when I mean public consultation requirements, if you look at the best practice regulation handbook, there's a checklist of information that you actually need to provide or furnish for RIA purposes in terms of how your consultation was conducted. So for example, you would need to put information in terms of who was consulted, how were they consulted, did you provide them information, and so on. But at the end of the day, you need to justify the means of your compliance, because you want to make sure that when you plan this engagement session, you need to get the right information that you ultimately plan for. Now, if you look at the cartoon on the right, you know, you look at the caption there. In order to speed up the system, I have my own personal member of the public to consult. So in that sense, it's just merely a tick the box or a compliance procedure. You're not doing it because you actively want to engage because you want feedback, but you're just doing it because it's something you're required in law to do, and you don't want that to happen. And lastly is to ensure the public consultation objectives are achieved. What are these objectives? Of course, this is peculiar to each and every consultation, and it's to be set by you depending on the level of engagement and what information you want to achieve from each stakeholder. Okay, next slide, please. So preparing the public consultation plan, I think a good starting point would be looking at a draft plan. But I'm sorry, I think in this scenario, usually we would do this in sort of a practical experience. But because this is online, so I'll just walk through this plan with you. But I'll try to make the best to make this as interactive as possible. So if you look at the public consultation plan, this is essentially the guiding document that should be shared with everyone involved in the project. So this is basically to ensure that the project can be implemented successfully in order to manage the expectations of the various stakeholders involved. So I didn't just want to take a screenshot of what a public consultation plan looks like. So I've broken it down into certain elements and I'll walk you through these elements. Now, the first thing that I like to start with is outlining the mandate of your consultation. So basically, you may not be the regulator, you may be a consultant, but it's very important in setting the expectation of the consultation and also defining the roles of the parties that will be involved in the consultation later on. Meaning to say who will actually be doing it, who will be sending the invites, who will be the paymaster. So the mandate is actually very important. The next salient point here is actually to define or spell out the background of the project. Now, it does not have to be exhaustive because this is just for consultation purposes. So you just need to give people an idea of where you're coming from and why you're doing the session. But at the very least, you need to be able to identify what other engagements you've done in the past, because I think that's very important in a sense where if you're going to engage with the same stakeholders again, you don't want people to say, hey, hari tu dah datang or hari tu ada cakap dengan you. So you need to make sure there's no overlap. Also, you need to be aware in terms of the possibility of that. Now, if you talk about the next step in terms of the stakeholder identification, I think we spoke about this at length last week. But if you see what is important here is essentially the stakeholder analysis, the stakeholder mapping, defining the objectives, the consultation levels, and the appropriate methods. So, for example, if you have a stakeholder in a high influence, high interest group, just take it as any industry business, then the objective here, what do you want from them? You want to obtain technical inputs in relation to your legislation. You want to obtain best practices in relation to a policy you're developing. So your consultation level with them would be probably to involve or to collaborate with them. And then what method would you use? Perhaps you put them into your technical working group, the working group between industry and regulators in developing this policy. So these people would be more involved than others. And you would do the same thing with other groups, with the public, with other ministries, with your ministries, with other agencies. So you would carry out the same stakeholder identification process and map it out across your range of stakeholders. So you'd have quite an extensive list of groups and also information in terms of the methods that you want to engage them with. Now, the next step to also consider here is the limitations of your consultation. I think it's very important here to be realistic because at the end of the day, we do want to conduct the best consultation possible, cover all the relevant stakeholders, and try the best, most unique, interesting methods out there. But there are so many constraints in the process. For one time, everything is always due yesterday. Money, you don't have the financial resources to actually carry out all the consultation that you want. And of course, resources in the sense that your manpower might be limited. You're a small department, you're a small unit, you're a small government agency. So this is very important because these limitations will actually determine what consultation techniques or methods that you use later on. And lastly, you need to think about your timetable, timetable as in timeline, because of course, this is the most important part of planning. I think if you work backwards, you will see there are a lot of moving pieces here. You know, everything always changes. So you need to have an expectation in terms of what is going to happen and when it's going to happen. A Gantt chart is very useful to see the end-to-end process. But as I mentioned, you need to be flexible, because in most cases, there will be a lot of changes here and there. And, you know, for example, someone can't make it, a certain group of stakeholders can't come on your day, you can't book a venue, you can't get a hotel, and so on. So you need to be flexible in terms of your changes, but the Gantt chart would help in terms of seeing the overall process. And the last one is evaluation. We will talk about that later. I think I put a note there on slide 28. And that's essentially how you evaluate the success of your stakeholder consultation and whether you give feedback later on. Okay, next slide. Now, this is the notification of the public consultation session. And if you remember earlier, when I mentioned the pre-consultation phase, there are essentially two stages, one of which was the planning stage, where we spoke about the consultation plan. And next year would be the notification stage, where we look at this hypothetical scenario to show the importance of basically notification or notifying early. Now, this is the plight of Makcik Kia. I think everyone here is well or knows her very well. So consider that you are Makcik Kia, and you are selling your pisang goreng in a kampung in Negeri Sembilan. Your business is severely affected by the MCO, and you wish to communicate with the government in order to obtain financial assistance for rural businesses. You are unaware that the various ministries and agencies involved have survey forms on their website, you know, inquiring about how businesses are affected by MCO. You're unaware that the various ministries, ministers, and agencies involved have promoted consultation on their social media accounts. You're not registered with CCM, SSM. You're not licensed with any local authority, nor are you a member of any business association or group. So you do not receive invitations on any mailing list. They don't share with you, you know, all the government circulars. You're not forwarded all this. You do receive WhatsApp messages from your friends on this initiative, but it's obviously you know, incomplete, piecemeal. Sometimes the consultation links don't work. And when you do find out later on of these sessions, there's little or no time for you to give input. Okay, let's think about this for a while. As you can see, Makcik Kia really wants to be consulted. She's having financial problems. She can't operate, and she is a relevant stakeholder. But the question is, why hasn't the notice reached her yet? So for one, if we look about, if we talk about the themes, the consultation method here is arguably not wide enough to reach her or accessible to her. Yes, you know, online consultation is always encouraged, but if we look at the public consultation procedures handbook, you need to be wary of your audience. If a specific or certain target group cannot be reached or cannot be given notice by this way, then perhaps you have to go on the ground. Perhaps you have to give a physical notice. Perhaps there needs to be people on the ground actually doing this outreach and communicating with her. Secondly, it needs to be early. But in reality, as I mentioned earlier, we're always short of time. Regulators are always under pressure to get things done quickly, and it may not be possible in all situations. For example, if we talk about COVID assistance, you know, the government needs information quickly, and then after that, the minister came up with a package, Prihatin 1. And then a lot of people came out and said, look, we were not engaged, we were not consulted, we were not covered. And then the government took that feedback and they came out with another package, Prihatin Plus. So perhaps there may be another one after being consulted again, Prihatin Plus Plus. So, you know, things need to be done quickly, and it may not be practical to reach out to all stakeholders in using all kinds of methods in this kind of situation. Now, if we look at the last one, the notification should be informative. Now, what do I mean when I say informative? It should be able to communicate just enough information to the stakeholder in order for the stakeholder to make an informed decision. WhatsApp messages are good because they are short and concise. But think of an example. What about the language? Was the language appropriate to Makcik Kia? Could she understand it? Was the notification given in bilingual, 2 languages, 3 languages? So you know, it has to be straight to the point, and it needs to be concise and easy to understand. And also, what happens if there is no correct link? As mentioned earlier, most people, they won't bother to actually go and find the right link even if they know that it's on a particular website. They just try, tak boleh, then okay, sorry lah, I'm not going to do it. So let's continue these thoughts on the next part, which is in relation to the consultation document. So if you look at the slide here on the consultation document, what is a consultation document? Basically, it says what it is. It's a document used for or used for during or as a preview before the formal consultation itself. Now, you want to give it to stakeholders to form an opinion on the issues before they give you an input. Now, I'm using this example of a bill, proposed bill that I saw on UPC. And I'm not sure whether you're aware of what foresters are. I didn't know too, but foresters is someone who is in the practice of managing forests. I just found that out. So now let's look at some of the core concepts of this public consultation document, which are broken down. The first one is basically the introduction. As you can see, and these are screenshots that I put on the left. What is the problem faced by the industry that requires the legislative or legal intervention? Now, foresters are professional. I've read a bit. Okay, foresters are professionals, just like any other professional body, such as lawyers, accountants, and these people are regulated. So, the narrative says it's high time that there's association for these people. Next is the objective of the legislation. What is the intended outcome in coming up with the statutory framework for these foresters? So you can see there the different objectives that they have. The third one would be the scope and the options. Now this is basically since they are proposing a legal framework here, they have produced the actual provisions that they want to put in the legislation. So some consultation documents would also show evidence of benchmarking. For example, what other countries are doing, so that we can be consistent, or when we engage with stakeholders, we're consistent in terms of the content of our legislation. Some consultation documents will also include non-regulatory options. Instead of coming up with this framework, can they be self-regulated and so on? So those are basically the scope and option part of the consultation document. And then the fourth one is we have the conclusion. Now this is basically telling you how and when you can give the feedback, and for the regulator, this is the most important part, because it's how you control what information you want, because you can control the manner and form of the document itself. So for example, if you just put a general question, please give me feedback, people will come out with all sorts of feedback. But if you want something favorable to you, you could perhaps design a poll, or you could perhaps design a questionnaire, and you could prescribe the different topics or questions that you want, and you can get people to vote. So you can control the information, you can control the way it's delivered, and therefore you can control the way it comes back to you. That's the most important part for the regulator to think about. And the last part here is, which I think the most important part to me as a stakeholder, is how do you follow up? If you actually read various consultation documents, not all consultation documents have this, because they don't want you calling them, they don't want you asking more than you need to ask, and simply sometimes because there's no manpower to actually be addressing that feedback. But this is where and who you should contact in case you have any queries. And I think this is important because it builds stakeholder trust, rather than just being an automated kind of process where we upload documents, ask you for your feedback, and then you give us feedback, because there's actually some interaction there. So I think people still do appreciate calling up and asking queries and getting personal explanation. Okay, next slide please. Okay, now we actually go into the public consultation session, and here what better way to discuss this than a case study. So I said hypothetical scenario, is it? I don't know. Let me just read it for you. So over 3-day industry convention, ministers provided a slot during a town hall session in order to address queries on various new policies and initiatives, including among others in relation to proposed legislation from a mix of stakeholders. The public consultation session was planned as follows. The objective was to create awareness on the proposed legislation and to obtain preliminary feedback prior to a formal consultation with specific stakeholder groups later on. Now the stakeholders, there are a variety of stakeholders here from the relevant industry, including regulators, businesses, and the general public. So you can see it's a mix. The method of engagement here was a town hall session to address a large group where Q&A would be conducted live together with Slido poll answering the most popular questions. Notice Notice was given several months in advance to inform stakeholders of the session, which was emailed to all in the relevant industry from the ministry's mailing list. The event was also prominently featured on the ministry's website and social media. So it's gone out there. It's a lot of notice given. Information. At this stage, there was no public consultation document prepared yet. Given there was no public consultation document prepared because there was no formal consultation plan yet. However, the minister and the KSU had been speaking on the various mainstream media outlets of the impending proposed legislation. So people were aware there was something coming. People were aware perhaps of a little bit of the content that will be involved. Now, how do you think this session went? Let it just sit with you based on what you know or what you've heard before this. I know you can't answer me right now, but given what we have learned, what do you think? I mean, it seems reasonable, right, that it would be a good session, given that it looks like it's incorporated all the good pre-consultation practices. There's defined objectives, there's identified stakeholders, there was a suggested method to be used, ample notice was given, people are aware of this. So, perhaps it went very well. Now, at the end of this chapter, let's look at this again. After going through the 10 things to know, by the way, I'm not saying that it went bad, but let's revisit this after we talk about the 10 things after this. Okay, next slide, please. Now, lesson number 1, basically knowing the presenter. Now, to me, this is one of the most important aspects of a good public consultation session, which is to have a good presenter. The presenter, or whatever name you call it, it could be consultant, moderator, speaker, panelist, so on, is basically the main person who is delivering the information. Look at the example on the left. I have two. The one on the top left, I think everyone knows him, Dr. Noisham, the DG of Health, every day appearing at 5 o'clock, I think, giving the briefing on the COVID situation in Malaysia, with scientific evidence. He's a doctor. He has practicing background for so many years. He's also worked with the ministry for so many years, and he's on the ground fighting this issue day in, day out. I think, that day in the press, he was given 1 day leave, and everyone was like, where is he today? Let's compare this with the guy on the bottom. I'm not going to say who, but you guys can probably guess. It's a foreign leader. And this is what he said in terms of the COVID situation. It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle, it will disappear. So this is how he addressed this issue. This is how he addressed the public on this issue. Now, if you think it's important for the right person to give the right information, it is, because if that person is not well informed on the topic, on the subject, is not respected in his field and his area, and is not authoritative, people will not have trust in him, people will not believe him, and the right message might not go across. So sometimes, in some cases, it might not necessarily be the consultant who is the best speaker. Sometimes it could be, if you look at the example earlier, the speaker was going to be the minister, the speaker was going to be the KSU, and I'll tell you why later on. Let's go on to the next slide. Next slide. Yeah, okay. So the next slide here is basically about knowing your audience. Look at the quote. The first word in public consultation is public, which means that it can be anyone. I like that. As you can see in the picture, you don't know who the people are, you don't know what their background is, you don't know where they're from. If you go into a public consultation session, do you think everyone is going to be your friend? Definitely not. Chances are this would be, that public consultation session would be the first time in your life that you met most of those people. And now consider the fact that you're meeting these people for the first time in your life, and you're also going to talk to them about issues which are, personal or sacred to them. Of course, stakeholder identification can help you find the right target group. So, for example, if you want to engage tour operators on tourism law, you can ask the tour operator companies to send their legal people, their policy people, their government relations people, instead of accounts or IT department people. But in the end, even though they send the right target group, you can't predict human nature, or you can't predict human personality. So you don't know if the people who are coming, are they going to be garang? Are they going to be quiet? Are they going to be involved, and so on? Now, if you look at certain types of audience members, I put some concerns there. What is this stand-in? Is it so typical in any consultation session that you go to. There's always going to be someone who will tell you, I had to go in last minute, I'm sorry, my colleague sakit, and I wasn't aware of this session until this morning, and then I'm here. And sorry, I tak pernah baca apa-apa, but my boss asked me to be here. So that is the the stand-in kind of stakeholder. And then you also have another common or popular one across the board is the loud voice, someone who always wants to be heard, someone who is always talking, someone who is always dominating conversations. Now these people are usually emotional and they're overbearing meaning tak nak dengar cakap lah. So when you tell them something, it's just me, I'm not listening to anyone else. And the last one is you have the opportunist groups. Now, there's always someone like this in a public consultation session. And I think these people are actually quite dangerous. They actually take the public consultation sessions to make a gesture or to come up with certain actions to be seen lah. And these gestures can be big, can be small. For example, there was one consultation session that I attended where a person actually came and took it as an opportunity to serve a court order on a panelist, on someone that was speaking. And there was also another session. I've also known someone from the industry. He's a very nice man, very nice. He's also the chairman of a certain industry association. During the public consultation session, he was very quiet. He kept to himself. But when the Q&A came, he made very strong remarks against the regulator. He was using very strong language, saying that as a regulator, if you don't recognize this industry, or if you don't regulate a certain industry, you're basically allowing a legal activity to be taken. You're basically recognizing a illegal activity. So he was very strong, very vocal. And what happens next? The next day, his face was on a front page of a newspaper with a quote, saying that, oh, this industry wants this done. So, these people have certain agendas, have certain, behind the scenes initiative. Now, I think it's important to consider these people, because when you think about the different type of people that will come, then I think you can come up with the ground rules for your engagement session. If you're expecting these individuals, then later you can use the tools in these other parts of these 10 sessions to actually help you design a better consultation session. Next slide, please. Now, the third lesson here is essentially creating the key message. Now, sending the right message is important to ensure that everyone is on the same page with the expectation of the public consultation. On the left, there are some features used by IAP2 in preparing great key messages. Let me just read them very quickly. The message must be believable, it must be understood, must be distinctive, must be clear, must be concise, and must be consistent. Now, the issue here is quite simple. Basically, and this is a human nature problem. So if we've come up with a great message, we've emailed the consultation documents to the public, given them ample notice, 2-3 weeks in advance, but at the end of the day, do you think people would have opened it? Do you think people would have read it? Because more likely than not, people coming on the day itself, that will be the first time they've looked into any of these documents, no matter how great it is. So another example here, in terms of creating that key message, is looking at the latest news. I mean, I think maybe this morning you read in the newspapers that, for example, Hari Raya open house can only be done the first day of Ramadan. Okay, and that's it. That's it. I think you've not gone, more likely than you've not actually read the whole article. You just looked at the titles, and you've not bothered to actually click into it to see what else it talks about, the justification, the rationale, and so on. So if you think about the next point, which is the different learning or communication styles, which I have down here, I think it's important to know what works, because if we look at communication styles, there's the auditory style, which is sound, and then we have kinesthetic, which is basically a hands-on, touch kind of approach, or visual, sight approach. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but according to statistics, what works best is visual. I think 70% or something of learners are visual learners. Hence, that's why if you look at social media, I think that's a very strong and important tool in actually delivering bite size of information. So when delivering key messages, it's important that it's, like I said, if you look at the bottom left, short, concise, something that can be delivered in 7 to 8 seconds. That's why social media is very good in terms of delivering this bite-sized information. Ambil gambar saya tengah masak, then people can see that. And that's why social media is so important, it's so popular and so important, because people appreciate that bite-sized information instead of reading all these very lengthy documents and reports. Next slide, please. Now, the next principle here is basically timing. On the left, we have some information which I got from an APEC peer review, I think conducted in 2018, measuring the effectiveness of public consultation in Malaysia. If you can read the box, businesses in Malaysia say they are not consulted enough before a draft legislation is prepared, and they are more likely to be included towards the final draft stage. This makes them feel like a rubber stamp in the process. So they're not adequately consulted, nor are their views or considerations taken into consideration. There are two aspects of timing here. One is the when, which I've talked about in part one, where consultation can be ongoing, but for different purposes. And second is actually the timing of the public consultation itself. Now, this is important because if you talk about the convention earlier, the convention was held over a weekend. It was on a Saturday. You don't want to do public consultation during public holidays. You don't want to conduct public consultation after hours. If this works for your stakeholders, then sure, go ahead. But generally, it won't work for most people, and most people won't be able to attend or participate in a meaningful way. Now, another consideration here is logistics, because you have to bear in mind that not all stakeholders are from the same place, same jurisdiction, same locality, same state, or even the same country. Therefore, you would need to have be reasonable in managing their travel times when you schedule a session. For example, maybe not too late, in the day, so they can go back, and not too early in the morning, because business people, industry people would fly in the morning. So these are things that you need to think about when you actually plan that session itself. Next slide, please. Now, another lesson to think about is actually maintaining confidentiality. Maintaining confidentiality is an important requirement of the consultation session. Only when stakeholders feel at ease or trust can the conversation be free and open between the parties. Now, on the left is an example of confidentiality language that is used in most consultation documents. This one I got from Bursa Malaysia consultation document. As you can see, it says here that your response may be made public, and if you do not prefer, please tell them otherwise. Now, in most cases that I've seen, it's actually drafted the other way. When I say drafted the other way, what I mean is your information will be kept confidential, but if you want us to disclose your information, please let us know. If you want us to identify, if you want us to cite you, please let us know. Now, what is the implication of having these two approaches? Pretty much the same in terms of getting that information from the perspective of the stakeholder, but the impact is different. So you see, to me, if you draft the language the first way, I'm concerned that my information would be disclosed, wouldn't I? So therefore, if I'm concerned and I have to tell them to, not disclose my information, more often than not, I could email them. Yes, I could tell them, please don't disclose my information. But the human nature would be malas lah, baik tak payah isi form tu. So in terms of actually getting the information and the impact, people would probably prefer the second, approach in terms of filling up and completing that form. Now, if the fear or concern with confidentiality is being the odd one out or standing alone, what do I mean by being the odd one out? You are essentially, the only one who's identified. Other people are anonymous. Therefore, people would say, jangan cakap macam tu. It's just you. It seems like it's only a personal problem, but it's not peculiar to you only. You might be the only company that stands out because you are the only company or organization that identifies yourself. Now, the impact of that is you may not want to be punished, because if you can be identified in the document as being the one who is raising or bringing up the issue, then there is this fear that regulators may take action against you. later on, or coming up with that issue or voicing out the issue. So I think those are some of the concerns in terms of why you want to be confidential, and why it's important to establish the grounds of confidentiality before you actually start the consultation process. Next slide, please. Now, this is about managing the physical space. What does this mean? IAP2 actually has a chart on this, which actually tells you where certain room setup options are actually more effective in during public consultation than others. No, so for example, if you talk about a town hall session, having chairs that face straight in general is, less effective compared to having chairs which face the speaker, at an angular sort of approach. Similarly, in a presentation, in a classroom presentation, instead of sitting in a long table where you have students or stakeholders talking to you at different lengths of the table, someone who's very far, someone who's very close, it's actually more useful to sit in a square table because you are equidistant from all the stakeholders. Now, all of this is relevant when you are conducting your engagement session, because it controls the delivery of information. If you sit in a adversarial manner, i.e. opposing manner, it becomes more of a debate, me against you sort of situation. Now, what do you think of the discussion tables? Because when you have discussion tables, they are typically round, and there's actually a reason behind that. The tables are round because it gives you a sense of equality in terms of where you sit, in the sense of different stakeholders being around you. Now, you also need to be wary of where individual groups sits. Of course, in a scenario where you have regulators against industry, you wouldn't put them all together, and obviously if you put them together, they could actually transpire into a shouting match. So you want to engage these people separately. And similarly, if you have introverts and extroverts, or the loud voices, so to speak, you want to quickly manage these personalities, because you wouldn't want one loud voice to drown out the others, and in that sense you wouldn't be able to get information from your other stakeholders. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the next point I'd like to talk about here is the communication risk. Let me share an example of you when you're engaging on behalf of a ministry, for example, as your client. Let's use this stakeholder matrix, which I prepared last time on the COVID legislation. Now, imagine you are the consultant going around getting feedback on this legislation. You'll be engaging with a wide range of stakeholders, government, public, industries, regulators, but you will be the face of the consultation. Now, what do I mean by when I say you will be the face of the consultation? From the stakeholders' perspective, let's say, for example, from the public's perspective, you will be seen as representing the other party. So for the public, you will be seen as the face of the government. For the government, you will be seen as the face of the public. So in this sense, you would always be seen as the bad guy. The person who is conducting the consultation would be the one who is actually seen as the bad guy. Now, it may work strategically well for certain stakeholders, because you're actually taking a lot of pressure, off them. But in this sense, there's a lot of misunderstanding, basically because there are a lot of myths in the consultation process. So, for example, if you are seen as the bad guy, people would make personal attacks against you. You as the engagement consultant, or the person conducting the consultant, will be seen as the person who is proposing the legislation. People say, oh, Iza, you are the one who wants to do this, instead of it being a government issue. Now, if you can see on the right, there are a lot of concerns in this area. For example, one that you can talk about is the myth, ingrained beliefs by certain individuals that the government is doing something or creating legislation that benefits a certain group. For example, kerajaan nak buat macam tu sebab tu menteri tu punya syarikat. Or underscoping is another issue, where you don't really appreciate the severity of the issue. For example, last time we used to have the cry to have vape regulations. So if we did have it regulations, would it just cover the equipment, or would it also extend to be a wider health problem? Would it be an economic problem? Another issue is overpromise. You let the stakeholders believe that you can deliver something, but at the end of the day, you can't deliver. You don't have that authority, you don't have that power. You knew from day one that you can't do it. So you need to manage all these concerns. Now what I do to keep track here is to prepare a FAQ, because an FAQ actually keeps you on task in terms of you delivering a constant and clear message. So if you have that if you have the FAQ to actually be the four corners of your engagement, that will actually help you manage all these communication risks later on. Next slide, please. Now this is in relation to hospitality. Now don't laugh, actually hospitality is an essential part of this process. Now what does hospitality mean? Basically, you treat your stakeholders with some degree of care. I think everyone knows, in my last example, we talked about bengkel, and in Malaysia, how many times we have coffee break in one day? You can actually count the coffee break, tea break, maybe lunch. For example, we have breakfast, we have tea break, we have lunch break, then we have tea break again, we have dinner, we have supper. So that's at least 6 formal breaks, and then there are obviously informal cigarette break, tak tahan saya nak pergi minum coffee break. So there's a lot of breaks to actually give you time to recoup and recover. Now I put in a screenshot here, I used Mat Saleh example, because if I use a Malaysian example, I know everybody would see lah, the sarapan and so on. So it's pretty much we understand that. But even the Mat Saleh example also has a break. You can see at the bottom where they put outright that there are refreshments that will be served during the session. In fact, there was one that I've seen before and I couldn't find it. I wanted to share it here, which actually had an agenda, and it bolded all the breaks. Okay, I don't know why the agenda bolded all the breaks. So for example, the agenda said breakfast bold, and then opening remark, discussion on policy, and then Q&A session, and then buffet lunch bold. So this was a Russian agenda, but it seemed to bold every time that there was a lunch break. So jokes aside, why is it so important? It helps break the disinterest and also the consultation fatigue that could be overbearing at times during that particular session. Okay, now let's go on to the next slide, which is basically recording the information. This is one of the most underrated aspects of a public consultation session. So more often than not, we don't think about how we want to record the information. At most, we would only do it in a very basic way, have identify who are going to be our note takers, ask them to write on a pen and paper. We don't even think of the tools that they will be using. We only realize later on that we, after post-mortem, that we have issues, information was lost, paper was lost, and things not being recorded properly and so on. So the note taker also would have his or her bias. For example, if you read a minutes of a meeting, and when you read the minutes, you realize, hey, that's not what was said. That was something that that was something that was totally different. So everyone has their biasness. Culture plays a role too. For example, as I said during the first session, our culture is we don't like to write. There's a general fear that writing something is like very formal and is confirming something. So hypothetically speaking, if you have a bengkel, you could just have everyone on the table just answer questions. You don't even need to have a discussion. You could say, look, tell me your concerns and write it down. But why don't we have that? Why do we actually have people facilitating? Why do we have people actually note taking? Because it's not in our culture to actually sit down and write down the information. And lastly is the levels of listening, because you may have a different level of listening. Maybe you could be listening to yourself, you could be listening to a stakeholder, or you could be listening to a wider group. So it actually depends on where you're listening, but it's important to be open, because you don't want to have a biasness and limit and discard the information that you're getting early on. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now this is the last lesson, which is actually providing an opportunity to follow up. There are two things to talk about here. One is the lack of physical takeaway. And what do I mean by that? Everyone appreciates, being consulted. You're invited to a session, you go there, you give your input, you have the buffet lunch, and then after that, you make some friends, and then you go back. But sometimes you feel that something is missing if you leave empty-handed. And psychologists have said that it's important to have some sort of physical marker for you to take back. So there's actually an importance in having that feedback form on the table, and the feedback form allows them to give feedback on the consultation session and also on the issues later on. More often than not, in reality, people won't take the form. You'll see it on table. It's not it's not taken, it's not completed. But sometimes from pattern there will be people holding the form, even though they bring it back, they just throw it away when they go home. But they have that sense of belonging that they've had that form. Now, the second issue is on the stand-in stakeholders, and those are the people that I mentioned earlier who came last minute. Those are the people without authority, because they came in last minute. They don't know the issue. They don't know what to consult on. So they would need to go back and they would need to get the input and provide input later on. Now, for example, it also depends on what hat you're wearing. So for manager of a company, if you are consulted, perhaps you can't make the decision. You have to ask your CEO. If your CEO came, yes, the CEO can give you that input on the spot. Now, if the CEO is wearing the hat of the company, that's fine. But if the CEO is wearing the hat of an association, he probably needs the input or approval of the board. So he can't give that input himself. So you need to be able to make allowances for certain people to come back with the input later on. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now let's revisit this case study. After hearing the 10 lessons that I mentioned earlier, what do you think? Has your perspective or your thoughts on the session changed? Do you think, think about now who presented the information during our session? Who was in the audience? What was the key message? When was the consultation conducted? Was confidentiality maintained? How was the hall set up? Was there any communication risk? Were there any breaks, refreshments provided? How was the information recorded, and how do you follow up? So can I ask you, do you have the same information when you were planning the session earlier on, the pre-phase, and as opposed to now when you're actually conducting the session? As you can see, the considerations are different. So I know you can't give me the answer, but let's think about some things. Who presented? So in our session, it was the minister accompanied by the KSU of the ministry who was to answer the question. Who was in the audience? It was a mix of stakeholders, but the moderator would require each stakeholder to step up to the microphone and ask the question. There was also a Slido poll. Now, what was the key message? We basically to inform stakeholders that there will be a new legislation and there will be formal consultation later on. So all the responses that were given is going to be short and straight to the point. Now, when was the consultation conducted? Yes, it was conducted on a Saturday, but there was ample time given, ample notice given. I think it was months in advance that there was going to be this session. Now, were there any communication risks here? Plenty. A lot of people, anyone who saw this would jump on the bandwagon and take this as an opportunity. There were a lot of loud voices, that were talking about unrelated measures. There were a lot of unrelated initiatives being discussed. Some even spoke about unrelated issues, such as the need for legislation on another topic. So there were a lot of communication risks here. But how do you think it went? Now, to be honest, I think this session, on my experience, what I saw, it went actually very well. First, and why do I say so? I think in actually taking the answers in the Q&A, the ministry did a lot of work in actually controlling the information. Now, what they did very cleverly was actually to drown out the loud voices by having the minister not to answer directly. So it was actually less confrontational in that sense, because the minister answered at the end after all the questions were taken. So people went up, gave all the questions, and at the end only the minister answered the question. So the minister answered collectively. So when people were angry, were shouting, the minister was like, okay, nanti saya jawab. So in the end, when the minister jawab, there was no sense of aggression. Second one was there was a KSU there. So why is the KSU important? The KSU, same thing like Dato' Dr. Nurisham, been in the ministry a long time, has a technical background, and has all the data information in terms of what the ministry has been doing even before the minister was there. So the KSU could answer all the technical issues, and the minister could answer all the big broad policy issues. So the minister was very well protected. And lastly, how else did they deal with the loud voices? The moderator actually set very strong ground rules. anyone who breached the rules would be cut off from the mic, and the moderator also enforced using the Slido. So there was actually quite good controls in place to ensure that this didn't fail. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, Nancy. Okay, we're going to the last part of the session, which is basically ending the public consultation session. Now, why is it important to end the session? It depends on perspective. For regulator, you want to move on to the next phase, which is actually the post-consultation phase, and analyze the input to develop your regulation or policy. For the stakeholder, you want to know what decision has been made, and you would want to know whether your input has any impact in terms of the decision-making process. Now, what typically happens at the end, that's on the far right, you can see firstly, is basically notifying the stakeholders of the closure of the consultation session. This is symbolic to show that the process has completed and that we are all moving on to the next stage. However, at times you need to be flexible because there may be new stakeholders or there may be new issues that arrive during the public consultation stage. So you need to be flexible for that. The next one is actually on compiling the feedback. Now, this could be messy depending on how well you actually plan your recording of information. As mentioned earlier, the information comes in different forms: interviews, notes, recordings, online polls, and so on. So depending on how you streamline your information process, then this would be easier for you. And then the next one is in relation to the giving feedback. I think this is the most controversial aspect. People always ask, is it mandatory? Is it mandatory? Is it mandatory? As part of GRP, it's always important to try to communicate feedback as often as possible. But it may not be practical in all cases. For example, it depends on the level of engagement. So as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the spectrum, if you're informing someone of something, I'm telling the public of the pre-Hatin benefits, I'm just purely telling them. They may have comments, they may have concerns, but it's only a one-way conversation. There may be overriding public policy or national security reasons you can't disclose, for any particular public policy or national security reason. One good way to give feedback, which will be on the next few slides, is actually through the closure reports, which is more general and more generic. The next factor to consider would be on the lessons learned, and this is basically the questions on how you could do things better. As mentioned in part one, public consultation is not an exact science. You can come up with your own different levels of engagement and different methods, but it's not that any particular one will be perfect. So as mentioned, there's so many externalities, so evaluating how your session went would help you design a better session in the future. And the last one here is actually recording the information for the RIA and the risk purposes. As mentioned in the best practice regulation handbook, there's a checklist of information that you will need to fill in terms of who you engage, why you engage, and so on. So you would need to comply with those requirements if you are using it for RIA and risk purposes. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now this is the case study that I have in terms of the voting that we did. As you can see on the far right, that's a summary of the information that I had. 64% of the votes voted for the most popular topic, 40% or less voted for other topics, and then the general other tab where you could put in what you wanted to vote on. Nobody voted for that, so that's why Vimala is not speaking this week. On a side note, if you look at the percentages, they don't add up to 100. I'm not sure why. If anybody knows why, you can tell me later on. But why am I telling you this? So for those of you who voted, you are my stakeholders. Depending on which topic you voted for, and if you voted on the topic that one, you would be happy, right? The one that got 64% of the votes, you wouldn't care as long as this topic won, and then we cover this topic. But what about the rest? The rest who voted for the topics that did not win, you would want to know more information, right? You want to know why you lost. Now, what information did I not give you here? I didn't tell you how many people voted in total. I didn't tell you how many people voted in each particular category. Now, this is the same in public consultation. When we come up with the closure report, we are going to communicate that information. We're going to share how the decision making was made. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is essentially how features and themes in terms of preparing the closure report. The closure report itself is a final document which should wrap up the consultation process, and the closure report would typically document the results and the outcomes of the session. Now, it's a very good way to give feedback in an objective manner. If you see on the right, there are some of the considerations that you should include in a closure report. Identify the affected stakeholders, outline the summary of the public consultation, analyze the public consultation, provide the general comments, prepare the feedback, outline the conclusion and the recommendation, as well as read out or determine the way forward. Now, the secret to writing a good closure report, number one, is to be very succinct and concise. This means that you have a lot of information from your consultation session, but you need to filter, what you want to communicate. And this can be done, in a very effective way by concising it into charts, graphs, tables, and summarizing that lengthy information. And the next thing is to actually be informative. This is by capturing correctly what transpired by actually, having the salient details. When did it happen? How many people participated? How much feedback was obtained, and so on. So although there's a discretion not to disclose all the information, you need to make sure the salient information is there at minimum. And lastly is to be very neutral and objective. And I think this is very important in writing the report. There may be certain situations or decisions made by stakeholders which are negative. For example, a particular stakeholder did not want to do this, and therefore it brought about the demise or the end of the project, or the fact that we didn't take into account certain input. But you don't want to blame that stakeholder in the report. You don't want to say that it's so and so's problem or so and so's fault. That's why. So you need to be very objective and ensure that you're not emotive and cast any blame. So last but not least is the way forward, which I think is the most important for stakeholders, because they want to appreciate, and understand what happens next, and whether there will be an opportunity in the future to actually influence the policy and the decision again at a later stage. Next slide, please. Okay, now how do you measure the success of the public consultation session? Somebody asked me this question last week. I thought it was a very good question, and I wanted to touch on it. Now, if you look at the consultation, it's basically determined based on your objectives, objectives in terms of why you're consulting and what you want to achieve. And if you look at the bottom there, that's the gap analysis. You have the objective, you have the results, and then you come up with that gap analysis. That will show you in terms of what you have achieved in your consultation. And you can come up with various criteria in doing this gap analysis. If you look at the top, you can have the quantitative criteria, which are certain things like how many people participated, how many contacts you obtained, how many comments you received, or you can use the qualitative criteria on the right. In general, was the project a success? Did you get buy-in from the stakeholders? Did you manage to change perception? So these are all tools in terms of measuring your success. Now, in my research, I found this very interesting quote which I wanted to share. It basically says that stakeholders should only be concerned about the process of consultation, but not the results. Now, what do you think? Do you think that that is a fair comment? Because basically, what it is saying is that success is viewed from the perspective of the regulators, but not the stakeholders. So, for example, if you are a stakeholder, you got invited to Bengkel, again in Langkawi, stayed there 3 nights, gave input, had discussion, went for your buffet, had the tea break, met friends, and then later went back, to your business as usual. Would you be happy that you were just involved in the process? Is that something that you would say is adequate for you? Now, I'm leaving that as food for thought. Why don't you think about that and let me know if you agree with me later on. Okay, can I go to the last slide? Okay, so this is basically, just to recap. Sorry, I ran a bit of the time, but this is just to recap what we've learned today. I put this, in a house, and I hope this is something that is memorable. As mentioned earlier, key message is something that you should remember. And if you do think about this presentation, maybe 6 months from now, if anything, please just remember the house of how to prepare a public consultation. Now let's start with the roof at the top, which covers the topic on how to prepare the public consultation session. Then we have the highest level, which are the 3 phases, and then we have the next level, which are the stages: the notification and preparation stage, the consultation stage, and then the conclusion stage. At the middle part, we have the documents of consideration involved, the consultation plan, the consultation document, the 10 things to know, and later on the closure report, giving feedback and measuring success. And at the pillar or at the bottom, we have the timeline. In best practice should be 28 weeks, and the various breakdowns for each section. So if I've covered that very quickly, that's all I have for today, Vimala. I wish to thank everyone for being a diligent listener. I'll pass this back to our moderator, Vimala, and I look forward to some interesting questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Izzah, for your insightful presentation. Today you are cover about pre, during, and also after the consultation. Normally it will take 5 days or 1 week actually to cover the topic. Really appreciate to you because you already cover in 1 hour with a very informative presentation. Yeah. Okay, we go to the questions. We have a few questions here, but I think you already almost cover in your presentation. But I will read out. If you have any additional input, you can provide to for the questions. So number 1, do we need to set how many respondents are good enough for our consultation about the respondents? Even in our UPC, Unified Public Consultation, there are regulators doing a lot of survey. But then should they set how many respondents that they should receive in order uh, to make sure that the consultation is enough to get the opinion
Okay,
from the
so
stakeholders?
Okay, so this goes back to the point that I was talking about, the qualitative and the quantitative method, right? So when we say quantitative, then that would be one of the consideration that you use, yes. But in terms of actually having a preset number, that is up to you. I mean, because as I mentioned earlier, each consultation session is bespoke. It's tailor-made. I cannot say, for example, if you're consulting on a COVID act, you only need 20 people commenting, or you need 50 or you need 100, because you need to do your stakeholder identification first. You need to do your stakeholder matrix first. And then once you realize that, look, I have 1,000 stakeholders, perhaps I could say that 70% or 80%, that's a good number for me. So that could be one way of you to measure success, yes. But if I were to give you a finite number right now, I can't give you that number, because that would really depend on the range of stakeholders that you're consulting.
Okay, we have a question from Ms. Jamalia Dawood. Due to some reasons, for example, during this current MCO, regulators may want to conduct public consultation through video conference. Would there be specific do and don'ts to be considered for public consultation that is done this way?
A good question. I think, well, actually, in my research, I read an article. I think it was in Canada, and they are actually recognizing, during COVID. And this is, I mean, in a lot of overseas jurisdiction, they actually call it community engagement. Community engagement is done, at local authority level, but there's a very strong passion about doing local community engagement. So, for example, if you want to build a taman in your area, they, MPPG or whatever, they will come and consult with you. There's very strong a culture in doing community engagement. But my point on that is they've actually come up with SOPs in doing online engagement. I think in Malaysia we're not really aware of all the issues. I did talk about this on a separate webinar where I was talking about security concerns, because now we're using a lot of tools, and then a lot of us, we don't actually, I mean, this is the very early days of using online tools. I mean, it's been there, but because of COVID it's just accelerated the use of these tools. So before that, we've not been thinking about which tools should we use. We've not been thinking about the security of the tools. No one is regulating these tools. If we look at the regulatory framework, our regulators are incident based. So only if there's hacking or something happens, then only that they will investigate. But before that, like we're using all these platforms, they don't comply with any set standards. We don't know if they are complying any standards. We assume that they are, but there needs to be some SOP in terms of online consultation. I do agree with that, but I think right now we don't have that. That's something that they need to think about as and when it comes about lah.
Okay. Okay, we have a question from Nurul Shahida. Thank you, sir, for the informative and interesting topic discussed. It is enough if regulator only done consultation online, maybe in the platform of social media, especially to collect public opinion in general. No face-to-face consultation. Is that
No,
enough?
understand. No, I don't believe so. If you read the best practice regulation handbook and the online public consultation circular 2012, it actually encourages the government to move towards online consultation, and this was as early as 2012. But one thing I like about the document, it actually has the foresight to actually say, and you can read this in the document, it says that it doesn't mean that online consultation is appropriate in all circumstances, and that's a good recognition that of the Makcik Kia situation, where you might not reach her. She may be a very interested stakeholder, someone who is very relevant to the process, someone who actually needs a lot of help, but because of the lack of online tools, engaging people in rural Sabah communities, engaging orang asli, so on, you can't say that it's sufficient. So there may be in most cases there may be a need to actually still do physical consultation. I'm not saying it's impossible, but again, when we go back to the starting point, when we do the stakeholder matrix, then you should, your stakeholder matrix should identify who are the interested groups. Okay, you have your Makcik Kia. Does your Makcik Kia have access to internet? How's the best way to engage them? Maybe she can't be engaged through webinar, or she can't be engaged through poll or survey, but maybe you can send her a Facebook message. Maybe she use Facebook. So the answer is yes and no, but it really depends on the circumstances. But I think right now we're still at a stage where physical one-to-one consultation is still very much important part of our lives, and it's interesting to see how it will change in the months and years to come after this, especially given the COVID-19 situation.
Okay. We have another question from Ms. Chan Jinwa. What if the ministry have already decided on a preferred option to go ahead? Do they still need to conduct public consultation as part of RIA requirement?
Okay. As part of RIA requirement, yes, you do need to conduct a public consultation. That's a short answer, because it's a, as I mentioned during the first session, that's a fundamental pillar of RIA. But the problem, and the not to say problem, the issue is when they conduct public consultation with you, what is the objective of the engagement? Remember, if we go back to the spectrum in part 1, there are 5 levels. And if they are engaging you purely to inform you of something, that's one way, that's not two way. So I'm telling you that there is a new legislation, but whatever you tell me, I'm not listening, because my objective is just to create awareness. So depending on what stakeholder you are, your involvement, the objective of engaging you is different, and that also affects the input that you give. For example, if you are a very high interest group, high influence stakeholder, I would want you to be involved, because you are going to be the one who's implementing later on. I would want you to be involved because you are the one who's going to be complying later on. You are the one who's going to be giving me the industry standards, industry best practices. So in that sense, I would want you to be part of my technical working group. I would want you to be part of the decision making process. But if you are a stakeholder who has less influence or less importance, you may not be so influential in the decision making process. So it really depends on where you lie within that matrix of stakeholder mapping. But I agree with you in general, and reading the APEC peer review 2018 by Sue Holmes, there's always concerns on whether public consultation in Malaysia is a sham.
Okay, last question, Mr. Izaha, about the language. You have shared about the language just now. So what is the most suitable language that we can use for for the consultation document and closure report? Because we believe each consultation, there are various of stakeholder. We have industry, we have a regulator, we have general public. So what will be the most suitable language that used for the consultation document or closure report?
Okay. if you look at the key messages in both reports, consultation document, consultation report, it's you have to use layman language, something that has less jargon, something that's easy to understand. You don't want it to be too technical. Yes, you want. I said one of the key pillars or criteria is to give information. Yes, you want to say that this is berkaitan dengan 117 kanun berapa, clause berapa, and so on. Yes, but you don't want to copy the whole provision there. You don't want to, people won't read, people that won't understand it. So if you can summarize it the best way you can, maybe you can put references. You can read this, provision, you can read this case, you can read this act. Maybe you can put it in the schedule. So there's ways and means and delivering it. But I think the most effective ones that I have seen are the ones that are written, in plain language, very easy to understand, very simplistic, because that's the one that gets the message across. And even myself as a lawyer, I'm starting not to write, things that are too lengthy, because people won't read it. If it's too lengthy, at the end of the day, there's no value. And like I said in my webinar earlier, the reason why social media messages are so effective, is because it gets the message across, and that is visual. You show someone something, and that's it. Picture saya tengah masak dah. So that's the best way to get the information across.
All right. Okay, thank you, Mr. Izaha, for the presentation just now, and also all the feedback that you provide for the question that shared by our audience. Yeah. So we already at the end of the session. So before that, I would like to take this opportunity to share on our upcoming event, and would like to do some promotion. First, on a virtual advisory online. Virtual advisory clinic VAC for regulatory impact analysis. If the participant or anyone want to know more about the 7 elements of RIA, or want to know about the public consultation or unified public consultation, you can register through www.mpc.gov.my/RIA VAC. Okay, this is like a 1-hour session and a one-to-one session. Okay, so please grab the opportunity lah if you would like to know more about RIA and also public consultation. Okay, secondly, about our upcoming GRP Webinar Series. For next week, we're going to have for Iza, did you remember our part 1, part 2, you keep on mentioned about UPC, right? Unified Public Consultation. Yeah. So maybe some of our participants, they are not familiar with what is exactly UPC. Okay, so for next week, we're going to walk through Unified Public Consultation platform with our speaker, Yang Bahagia Dato' Oi, on the 20th May at 3 o'clock. So I hope all the participants today can join for our upcoming event. We will send invitation email after the session today. So for your information, today's webinar session has been recorded and will be uploaded in the MPC website within next few days. Survey form will be provided at the end of the session, and really appreciate if all the participants can complete it for our further improvement. So if the participant have any further question that we can't share just now, you can email to me at vimala@mpc.gov.my. Maybe we can try to give a written answer to you through email. So thank you very much once again, and selamat berbuka kepada semua Muslim, kepada kawan-kawan kita, and be safe, stay productive. Thank you.
Thank you.